Hi, I'm Caroline. Welcome to my channel where we talk about reading, writing, and storytelling. And today I am really excited for this video. I am talking about something really exciting that I did. I attended a virtual writing conference and I want to talk about the experience and some of the things that I learned. So the Writing Romance Mastery Summit was hosted by Paula Judith Johns and it ran from Monday, May 18th to that Friday. And this conference did the very cool thing that I'm seeing more and more often with online conferences where there's a free tier of ticket, and the free tier you can have like live access to the sessions and then like a limited amount of time to watch a replay. So I've seen some conferences that you can see the live session and then you have 24 hours to watch the replay if you couldn't attend live. This one, the Writing Romance Mastery Summit, gave you actually 48 hours on the free tier, and then there is a paid tier where there's some like additional bonuses, and then you also get like forever access to the replays. So I did just use the free tier, and I attended kind of as many of the sessions as I could during the week. And full disclosure, I did try to vlog during the week where I actually was attending these sessions and kind of giving my thoughts as I went through and as things were going on. But it was the very first time I ever tried to vlog, and I didn't really end up with very much usable footage. And so because I didn't want to just scrap the whole video idea entirely, and because I really do feel like I got a ton out of attending this conference, I decided I was just going to do this sort of sit down, retroactive, like reflection on the experience and what I learned and some of the takeaways. So that's what this video is. So the night before the conference was set to start, I did like sit down and plan out exactly like which sessions I was hoping to watch, what day maybe I could watch them, because again, I had access the day that they were live and then for 48 hours afterwards. And so I sat down and I went through the entire schedule for the conference and planned out which sessions sounded interesting to me, which ones were relevant to things I was working on, and which day I was going to try to watch them. And this week of the conference, I was working, but I did have a half day on the Thursday and then the Friday off. So I kind of like backloaded the sessions that I was watching throughout the week. So I planned on watching like 16 of the sessions, or I had hoped to watch like 16 of the sessions over the course of the week. And that ended up being a little bit over ambitious. I ended up watching 12, well, actually 12 and a half, but the one downside of this particular conference was the website didn't let you like scrub through the video and the recording. So if your browser closed or you had to like go away and then you had to go back to it and it had like refreshed or something, you couldn't like go back to where you were in the video. You had to just like start from the beginning again. So there was one session that I had been watching and then my browser refreshed, and I feel like the session was one that I was super invested in. I didn't feel like rewatching from the beginning. So I watched 12 and a half, but we're going to say 12 of the sessions. And for the most part, I thought it was amazing. There was such a wide variety of presenters, a wide variety of topics. I mean, in the context of writing romance specifically. So for this video, I want to just share some of the takeaways from this conference that I had. And these are the things that like I am going to be thinking about as I do my own writing moving forward. And I feel like were really valuable to me as somebody who loves the romance genre and who is writing romance. And I do want to just like say that I am clearly cherry picking just small things from the presentations that stuck out to me. There was so much information in this conference, I can't like share all of it in one video. And I also just want to say like I'm sharing my understanding of what the presenters were saying. So my first thing I want to talk about is that I learned that slow burn romance might not actually be what I thought it was. So before this conference, I would say that I thought that slow burn romance was just a typical romance, but the characters took longer to kind of take the leap and actually get together, like their first kiss, whatever, it happened later in the story. But if you had asked me if there was like a structural difference in terms of like the plot structure of a slow burn romance versus a non-slow burn romance, I think I would have said no. And Abbie Emmons, who has a large YouTube channel, if you're not familiar with her, go check her out. She actually gave a talk on slow burn romance. And during the talk on slow burn romance, the host of the conference, it was kind of like a Q&A type thing, she asked Abbie how to make that transition to the relationship phase in a satisfying way for the reader. And Abbie's answer really gave me pause. She said to make sure that the character's inner transformation brings them to a place where that payoff is possible in a way that it wasn't before. And it made me think about how structurally, in terms of like the romance beats, that moment of transformation lines up differently with when they actually get into a relationship between a slow burn romance and a non-slow burn romance. And I am kind of like extrapolating from what Abbie said here. So I'm not just saying things that she said. I'm kind of adding some of my own interpretation and thoughts here, just as an FYI, because I think it's really interesting to think about like story structure and romance beats and things like that. But what I mean when I say that the moment of transformation lines up differently with the romance beats between a slow burn romance and a non-slow burn romance is that in a non-slow burn romance, the two characters, they are in a relationship before the moment of transformation. There's a push and pull between these characters, and that relationship itself is like an agent and a driver of transformation. And then when that transformation happens, there's like a recommitment to the relationship, and they're able to get their happily ever after. So they transform, and it's what makes the happily ever after believable and possible. But it's not transformation that allows them to be in a relationship at all. And based on what Abbie was saying, I think that in a slow burn romance, and let me know if you agree, but I think that in a slow burn romance, that moment of transformation happens before they get into the relationship, and getting into the relationship and the happily ever after can kind of be condensed into a single beat. So I like to think about Gwen Hayes and Romancing the Beat quite a bit, not because I always use every beat in that structure, but because I think it offers a really great framework for thinking about like a romance arc as like the A story in a romance novel. Because so often in other genres, a romance is a B story or a subplot. So I think that when we're thinking about like Gwen Hayes' Romancing the Beats, there's like a midpoint of love at the midpoint, and that's like where they declare themselves. And in a slow burn romance, you might not have that, right? Like they might not get together at the midpoint. And that moment of transformation that in a non-slow burn romance would happen closer to the grand gesture or closer to like the end of the romance arc when they're going to recommit, both characters are going to recommit to the relationship and find that happily ever after. That's when the two characters in a slow burn romance make that transition into an actual romantic relationship. And I think that it's really interesting to think about for two reasons. One, because I think, romance has this rap of being formulaic and kind of always following the same beats. And I think that this really highlights that even within a romance, like there are structural differences to the different subgenres. And if you're somebody who wants to write slow burn romance, like being familiar with kind of the expected beats and progression of the relationship in a slow burn romance is really useful. And two, I think it's really useful and interesting to think about just because for me, as somebody who has not written a slow burn romance, and honestly, like typically I don't read a ton of slow burn romances, I haven't necessarily thought about like, structurally from like a beat perspective, kind of what are the differences here and how do things line up differently. So I found that talk really, really interesting. So the next thing I want to talk about is this talk that was about turning a small town romance into a cozy romantasy. And I loved this talk. I thought it was such a unique topic, and I think it really like hit on things that are really huge in the market right now. Like cozy is, I think, very big. Romantasy obviously is very big. This was presented by Zinzi, Bree, and Katherine Suzette. And it, I think, really was one of my favorite sessions from the summit. I haven't necessarily talked too much about this, I think, in videos on the channel yet. But I do have a cozy, like, fantasy, cozy romantasy project on the back burner. Right now, I've been talking about and working actively on the zero draft of my Highwayman historical romance. But I do have this project that is like a cozy romance that I would love to get back to. And this talk gave me a lot to think about in regards to that project. And when I actually do go back to that project, I'm going to be revisiting my notes from this presentation, definitely. And there was a lot in this presentation that I found valuable. But the one thing that I really want to focus on right now in this video is that cozy romantasy, much like small town romance, is really based on a strong sense of place and a strong sense of community. And something that the presenter said that really resonated with me is that readers will fall in love with a place, and if it feels like home to them, they'll want to return. So if you're going to be building like a setting for a cozy romantasy series, much like a small town romance series, that setting needs to bring people back. People need to fall in love with it. And so because that sense of place and community is so important, populating the setting, the town, is really important, right? Because characters are what are going to make up that community. And so the presenters, Zinzi and Katherine, they gave this framework for thinking about the characters you should have in your setting. And again, I don't know that you need exactly the numbers they say, but I think it's useful to think about. And they called this framework the town tree. And they separate characters into 3 different categories. And there are the roots, the trunk, and the branches. So the roots are your protagonists. And these, they say 2 to 12 characters, where depending on kind of the size of a series you're planning, assuming you're planning a series, right? So if it's a single book, it's just 2. But if you're planning a series, like you could have up to 12 or whatever you want, really. But these are characters who are going to get their own books, basically. They're going to either be the protagonists of this first book, or you know that they are going to get their own books later on in this series. And those are your roots. And then you have the trunk. And they recommend you have 3 to 5 characters who fall in this category. And they are like pillars of the community. These are characters that appear in every one of your books in this setting, in this series. And they are very like intertwined in what's going on. Like this could be a town mayor. This could be a teacher, a religious figure, a town gossip, an inn owner, a tavern owner. And they have this role of providing town gossip, introducing people. They can provide gossip. They can tell stories about the town history, things like that. And they are going to be reoccurring characters, but not get their own books, right? And then the last category are the branches, and they recommend 15 to 20 of these characters, and these are the characters that are more minor characters. They populate the town and make it feel lived in. They do the jobs every day. They're, the waitresses, they're the garbage men, they're showing up at community events, and they're providing that like day in, day out interaction and really making the setting feel lived in. And the characters across all of these categories are meant to interact and connect and have these like dynamic community relationships. And I just really like this framework because I love a framework, but for me, it helped me personally because I realized I don't really necessarily have the pillar characters figured out. Like I know in my personal project, I know that I have my protagonists and I have my side characters, and then I need to kind of play around with that idea of a pillar character and the roles that they play, because I think that's really important. Introducing people, providing gossip, giving history, things like that. And so I really enjoyed that part in particular of the presentation. The next thing that I want to talk about is a closed versus an open series. And these were terms that I had not actually heard before. I learned them by attending this session, and I find it really useful to have the vocabulary to talk about what these things are. So this was in a session called Planning Your Series in Advance, and it was presented by Kristina Stanley. Talked about a lot of different things, but again, this was the thing that was my main kind of takeaway. And so I have actually read both open and closed series before. I'm very familiar with them, but I didn't know the terms. And I do think that having a term for this sort of thing is useful. So a closed series is what we typically think of when we think of a book series, right? It is a series of books that has an arc that goes all the way from book 1 to the last book in the series. This is the type of series where you read book 1 before you read book 2, before you read book 3, and so on. Like Harry Potter, for example, is a closed series. And then we have an open series. And we often see these in romance, but they're often called interconnected standalones, is kind of what I've seen them called. And these are series that have an unlimited number of books, but they do have some sort of unifying linking factor. So this could be a setting, it could be a theme, it could be members of a family, for example, like Bridgerton, where all of the love interests are from the same family. It could be anything like that, where there's a linking factor across all the books. And the section of her talk where Kristina Stanley was talking about open series was really particularly interesting to me, because she was talking about planning a series in advance. And I think often with open series in romance, we tend to treat them as standalones, interconnected standalones. And she really advocated for planning out first 3 books in an open series, at least, when you're starting the series. And this is not like writing a whole outline for every book, for every one of the first 3 books. She said you should know the protagonists, their goal, and the stakes if they don't achieve their goal. Those 3 things for the first 3 books in your open series. And she also said that you should make some decisions about the things that are going to need to stay consistent across the whole series, no matter how many books it is. And those things that need to stay consistent are whatever your unifying factor is, the linking factor. So is it that it's cowboy brothers on a certain ranch? Is it like Bridgerton, where it's people in a family? Is it people who go to a certain school? Is it people in a certain town? Something like that. Whatever your unifying factor is that's going to go throughout your whole series, decide on it. And then also your tone of your books, because if you have book 1 that's like very light and rom-com-y, and then you have 4 in the series and suddenly you have a dark romance, like that is going to throw readers for a loop, even if they're in the same setting, right? Like you have a town, you've decided, oh, I'm going to do all these romances in this town. The tone matters. And the third thing, which is kind of similar in terms of like you're setting your reader expectations and you don't want to upset them later in the series, is your heat level for the series. And I think that it's really interesting to think about like making sure that you know this going into a series if you're planning on doing an open series. Next thing I want to talk about is building chemistry between your main character, your love interest, and the importance of showing compatibility between them. And there was a talk, and it was called The Romance Equation, presented by Emily Golden and Rachel May. And they talked about the importance of the main characters actually showing that they're compatible. And they pointed out something that's really important for romance writers to think about, that writing a happily ever after is not enough. You need to write a believable happily ever after. Readers need to believe that these 2 characters are going to be together forever, or happily for now, but they need to believe that these 2 characters are meant to be together at this point in time. If there's a romance novel where you get that happily ever after scene and the reader leaves the book thinking they're going to break up, if they were real, they would break up next week. That's not a satisfying ending. Emily and Rachel in this presentation, they gave some really great strategies for thinking about building and showing that compatibility between the 2 characters over the course of a romance novel. And so I just want to share some of these strategies that I wrote down in my notes, because I definitely am going to be going back to these as I revise my book, and making sure that I'm kind of showing compatibility between my love interest and my main character. So the 2 characters can have shared goals. For example, they could both be elite athletes or something like that. Or it could be something more abstract. So these 2 characters, they're both striving to make their families proud of them. And a shared goal between these 2 characters can make them feel like this person understands what I am going through. They understand me because we have this shared approach, this shared goal, right? Or another strategy is that they can have shared values. So there can be different goals, even opposing goals, where the value that is underneath it is the same. Or they can have similar wounds in their backstory. And this doesn't need to be that they both went through the exact same thing, the exact same trauma, but there can be like a thread of similarity between their wounds. So maybe they were both rejected by a parent, or they both feel guilt for something that they feel like is their fault but isn't their fault. Or maybe they both went through something traumatic and violent, or a natural disaster, or something like that, right? And when there are similarities between the characters' wounds, there is this sense between them of, this person understands my pain, this person understands what I've been through. And that can build compatibility as well. Another strategy that they said is that a character can offer a perspective that a character has lacked. So maybe like a character feeling, I've never felt kindness like this before, or this person treats me in a way I haven't been treated before, or this person respects me, or respects what I have to say, or listens to me, and that's something I haven't experienced before in my life, right? And so that too is a way to start building compatibility between the characters. Then the last strategy that they offered is having the character see the other character's true self, even if they try to hide it. So this character sees something about the other character that they try to keep hidden from everyone else, and this character sees through it. And that in itself can build some compatibility. And I thought it was interesting that Emily and Rachel really emphasized that you don't need to have all of these things to have compatibility. The ones that you're going to use, the strategies that are right for your story, they really depend on the story you're telling and the tropes you're using and your setup and your specific characters. You do want to have some of these things, because if you don't have any of them, where is the reader going to start believing that the characters belong together? And so as an example of like a situation where some of these might be right and might not, like an enemies to lovers story, your characters are probably not going to have shared goals because they're enemies. A rivals to lovers story, they might have shared goals. They might be competing for the same goal, right? But even in an enemies to lovers story, where the goals are different, there's probably some sort of underlying value that is the same. Maybe it's justice, and just what justice means for each of them has resulted in opposing goals. And then I want to bring in something from one of the other talks as well as I talk about building compatibility and chemistry. And I'm actually going to go back to Abbie Emmons and her talk on slow burn romance, because I think it's really relevant to this point about showing chemistry and compatibility. So in her talk on slow burn romance, Abbie Emmons was asked about some ideas for how to show chemistry and compatibility between a couple when they're not kissing yet. Because again, slow burn romance, they're not together for a lot of the book, right? And she had some really great suggestions for some different ways that you can build chemistry as well. So for example, inside jokes, nicknames that come from inside jokes. Having one character be really aware of the other, even when the other character's not there, aware of them physically, aware of what they're feeling, something like that. So one character could be very protective of the other. Characters could think about one another while the other person isn't there. They could have shared secrets, could have opportunities to share things with each other that they have shared with very few people. For example, like an unexpected truth or vulnerability kind of springing out of a moment of connection between them. And there's also like maybe the potential for like a hurt comfort scenario was the last one that I wrote down from her presentation. And so I hope some of those strategies are useful for you for building chemistry and compatibility in your romance novels. I'm definitely going to be revisiting that list and my notes from those sessions. Next, being mindful of what your characters say to each other when they argue. And by your characters, I mean your love interest. So I attended the session Dialogue Do's and Don'ts, and this was presented by Miranda Darrow. And she's on YouTube, so I will make sure to link her YouTube channel in the description box. And she gave a lot of really great advice for using dialogue and how to write compelling dialogue. But my main takeaway that I want to talk about was in response to the host question, and I'm paraphrasing here. How can we write arguments or disagreements between our characters without the characters seeming cruel or irredeemable? And I think that this is a really great question, because I think in romance novels, we often have a breakup scene, we have a disagreement, we have this push-pull between the characters. And I do think that we need to be aware of like the line that we shouldn't cross with our characters, because a reader might not believe that the characters can come back from it and get their happily ever after. And I thought that Miranda Darrow's answer here was really, really interesting and compelling. And she drew on something that apparently real life marriage therapists will say. I learned it from Miranda Darrow here, but that you should not attack the person. You should attack an action or a feeling, something like that. People who love each other shouldn't demonize each other. It can be anger and criticism, valid anger and valid criticism about an action or about an inaction of someone else, but it should be focused on that action or inaction itself and the feelings that it caused, and not necessarily the person, like a personal attack. And one example that Miranda Darrow gave of this is a character saying, "I've lost faith and trust in you," as opposed to saying, "You're untrustworthy." Another example that she gave that I thought was really helpful was the example of a character saying, "You're a gold digger just like your mother," which is like a personal attack, and it even doubles down and insults somebody's family. I really liked this section of Miranda Darrow's presentation because I do feel like there is a line in arguments, even between fictional characters, that it is hard to come back from. And I feel like I've personally read romance novels where, because of something that was said in the breakup, the Act 3 breakup argument, I didn't believe the happily ever after. I didn't like the happily ever after. I feel like there are times where I've read things where if I had been one of the characters and somebody had said that to me, I would have been like, "I'm done, get out." Like, nobody who loved me would say that to me. I think obviously there are exceptions to every rule. There are things that depend on your story and your subgenre and all of those things. But I do think it's worth being aware of as an author, to go through what words your characters are actually using when they're arguing, and make sure that you're not doing something that you don't intend, right? So the next thing I want to talk about, my next little section, is strategies for brainstorming a meet cute. And there were 2 talks actually in the conference that kind of touched on this topic, so I'm going to draw from both of them here. The first one was in a presentation on writing romantic comedy presented by Alexa Bigwarfe. And she talked about a lot of great things, but one thing that she talked about in terms of a meet cute specifically was how you shouldn't discount drawing from your personal life or the lives of people in your life in order to come up with humorous situations that aren't cliche or overdone, or perhaps are clearly meant to be funny but kind of come off a bit heavy-handed or kind of cringy. And she talks about how in one of her books, her meet cute was drawn from something that happened to her in real life, where she was on a treadmill that started malfunctioning. And I just think it's a great reminder that the world is full of wacky, weird, wonderful things and funny situations. And these things happen to us, they happen to our friends, they happen to people in our lives. And it is worthwhile to pay attention to those things because they can serve as inspiration for a meet cute. And then the second part that I want to talk about for a meet cute and brainstorming a meet cute is the presentation by Savannah Gilbo, who has a great writing podcast. Go look it up. And her presentation was called Exciting Inciting Incidents, which is kind of like a tongue twister, but it's a great presentation. And she talks about a lot of things having to do with inciting incidents and meet cutes, which in romances tend to be one and the same. Your meet cute is your inciting incident, your inciting incident is your meet cute. And she talked about when brainstorming a meet cute, you can think about your character's wound, your protagonist's wound, and what are the situations that are most going to poke at that wound and cause a reaction and really highlight that kind of pain, right? And then how can we make that situation even more interesting? But the part that I found really valuable here is the ways that she talked about adding that interest. So not just what's a situation that's going to poke at your character's wound, but how can we make it really interesting? And she gave some suggestions for things to think about, and I think this is really, really valuable. So first, you can think about unusual settings. You can think about forced proximity situations. You can think about cosmic timing, or weird coincidences, 2 people bending over to pick up the same thing at the same time. You can think about high stakes situations. And I think that that's really fun to think about, because I think you often hear the advice about like having a meet cute poke at one of the wounds, right? And it can be phrased differently, like, but I think that is advice you hear a lot. But I think that the second part of her advice, which was to think about how to make these situations unique and compelling and fun and engaging, and then in particular that list, and I think there are more things you could add to that list, but I think that's really useful to think about it as a two-part question here, right? And then she recommends you generate as many as possible. You go through the list and you pick the one that most aligns with what you're trying to do. So I liked that advice a lot. The next one, what would make your character say no? And this came from a presentation by Rhonda Douglas, and it was called Keeping Desire and Stakes Rising in the Messy Middle. I thought this was really interesting because it offered a different perspective on what the midpoint of a romance can or should be. According to Rhonda Douglas, a midpoint should be a reversal. She says it's the point where the reader thinks these two people are going to be together, and then one of the characters says no. I found this very interesting because, as I said before, I'm somebody who likes to think about Gwen Hayes and Romancing the Beat. And in Romancing the Beat, the midpoint of love is like the two characters get together, right? It's not the point where one of them is saying no. That happens a little bit later in Romancing the Beat. So I do think it's really useful to think about, like, these beat structures are not the end-all, be-all. Like, Romancing the Beat is great. It might not be right for every story, right? Rhonda Douglas's idea of a midpoint is great. It might not fit every story. So knowing different ways people think about story structure for romance in particular is great. I think that, again, so many people think it's so formulaic and you just have this one structure for a romance, and it's just not true. And the more that we as romance readers and writers can learn about the different ways to put these stories together, the better writers will be, I feel. But back to Rhonda Douglas, because even if a reversal isn't at the midpoint, and she says that it is, but the way that she posed the question of what's behind the reversal was really striking to me, because she asked, what is it that will make your character say no to the relationship, one or both of the characters, right? Like, what is the reason? What makes them say no? And this is all very specific to this character and their wound and their backstory and who they are. And she gave some example answers of things that could possibly be the reason, could be the answer. A secret, a mystery, a family complication, things like that. And I think that when we're thinking about either a reversal at the midpoint or a third act breakup, asking the question, what is it that would make this specific character say no to this relationship, is a really succinct way to put it. And I think it cuts through a lot of the noise that we often have when we're like going through our outlines and going through craft books and all of this stuff. Like, it's a simple question. What would make this character say no? So I really liked that. And it's something that I'm going to be thinking about. And because I think without it, they're breaking up for the sake of breaking up. They're breaking up because it's a beat that's expected to happen. No, there needs to be a reason behind it. So I liked that. So if you have made it this far in the video, leave a brain emoji in the comments, because like my brain, I feel like was like stuffed full of information, and I hope that this information was useful for you. And I think even with like the technical issue of not being able to scrub the video and some issues I had with the website, like this conference was well worth my time in attending. And I absolutely am so grateful that this conference and other writing conferences are doing the free tier where you have a limited time to access the sessions. I am so thankful to the Writing Romance Mastery Summit, to Paula Judith Johnson, the host, to all of the presenters who gave these sessions and taught me so much. And I really do feel like there were times where I was listening to the sessions where I was like scribbling down notes, because I had ideas for my work in progress. I had ideas for my cozy fantasy, for my historical romance. I had some things that like clicked in my mind as these people were talking. And this is one of the reasons I love craft books. I love craft classes. I love sessions like this, because I do really feel like they spark something in my brain, and sometimes I just get the ideas that I didn't even know I needed that help me with my story. And so I hope that you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments below if you did. Let me know if you've ever attended a writing conference in person or virtually, or if you would ever want to. Let me know if any of these tips were useful to you or if you disagreed with any of them. And I'd also love it if you would just let me know what you thought of the video. I was personally disappointed that I couldn't do the vlog of doing the conference session, that I didn't end up with usable footage from that. So let me know if you thought this kind of retroactive sit-down video was good, if you liked it, or if you would want to see other videos like this from me in the future, or maybe for me to try vlogging a different writing conference, something like that. But that is going to be it for me today, and I will see you all again very soon in another video. Bye!